There is a street in Paris that locals used to cross when they saw a particular family coming. Not because the family was dangerous or that they had done anything wrong. Not because there was any law that said you had to move. People just did. Quietly, automatically, the way you might step around a puddle without really thinking about it. The father would be walking with his wife, his young son beside him, and the street would just subtly rearrange itself. A shopkeeper would find something very interesting to look at behind his counter. A neighbor who had been walking toward them would suddenly remember an errand in the other direction. Mothers would pull their children a little closer without saying a word. Nobody was rude about it. Paris was too proud a city for open rudeness. They were just careful, and that carefulness never went away. The family's name was Sanson, and the reason people crossed the street was simple. The Sansons were the official executioners of France, had been for generations. It was not a secret, it was not a rumor, it was simply a fact, the way the shape of a man's nose is a fact, inherited, unchangeable, and impossible to leave behind when you walk out of the house in the morning. And the young boy walking beside his father on that street, the boy who was learning, without anyone sitting him down to explain it, exactly what kind of life he had been born into, that boy was Charles-Henri Sanson. He would go on to become the most prolific executioner in the history of France. He would carry out over 2,700 executions across 4 decades. He would execute a king, execute a queen, and execute the man who ordered most of those executions. Through all of it, the revolution, the terror, and the complete collapse of everything France thought it understood about itself, he would show up every single day, do his job with quiet, professional precision, and go home for dinner. This is his story. Charles-Henri was 12 years old when he first began to truly understand what his family's profession meant in the world beyond their front door. Before 12, he had simply lived with the distance. He had grown up knowing that other children did not play with him, that adults spoke to his parents with a particular careful politeness that had nothing warm inside it, that the Sanson name opened certain doors and quietly closed most others. He had accepted this the way children accept most things that have always been true for them. It was simply the weather of his life. But at 12, something shifted. He started noticing not just that people treated his family differently, but why. He started seeing the tools in the house with new eyes. The blades stored neatly and cleaned after use. The ropes coiled and tested. The paperwork his father kept, names and dates and sentences written in careful handwriting. He started understanding that his father was not just a man with an unusual job. His father was the last step in a process that the entire city of Paris depended upon, but preferred not to think about. The courts decided, the judges signed, the guards transported, and then, at the very end of the chain, when the law had finished speaking and all the words had been used up, his father stepped forward. His father began correcting him around this time. Not harshly, not with lectures or speeches, just quietly and consistently, the way a craftsman shapes an apprentice. Stand straighter, speak less, keep your face still. Never let them see you react. The work requires a man who can be present at the worst moment of another person's life and remain completely composed. Not cold, not cruel, just steady. The way a surgeon is steady, the way a judge is steady. Because if the person doing this work loses control, even for a moment, everyone in that square loses something. The dignity of the sentence, the order of the law, the fragile agreement that holds civilization together. Charles-Henri listened. He always listened. He did not have the luxury of deciding this was not his concern. By the time he was 16, the gentle shaping of his earlier years had given way to something more direct. This was training now, real training, and it left no room for pretending otherwise. His father taught him anatomy the way medical schools never taught it, not from books, not with diagrams, but from the specific practical knowledge of a man who understood exactly how the human body responds when the law is finished with it. He learned where the neck gives way. He learned how much force is required and how much is too much. He learned that hesitation is the enemy, not because it is cowardly, but because it turns a clean, lawful sentence into a public spectacle. And public spectacles are dangerous for everyone involved, especially the man standing at the center of them. He learned restraint, not the moral kind, the physical kind. How to manage a condemned person who does not want to be managed. How to keep your footing when a crowd of hundreds surges forward all at once. How to remain functional when people are screaming at you, praying at you, cursing at you, or weeping so hard the sound of it fills the entire square. How to do the job when everything around you is noise and emotion and chaos, and the only still point in all of it is you. He met other boys during this period, sons of executioners from other parts of France, other cities, other families carrying the same inherited weight. One of them talked constantly about justice, about the importance of the work, about how history would remember the men who served the law with honor. He was enthusiastic in a way that made Charles-Henri quietly uncomfortable. Enthusiasm in this profession seemed to him like exactly the wrong note to strike. You did not do this work because you loved it. You did it because it needed doing, and you were the one it had been given to. He kept that thought to himself. He was already learning that the most useful thing he could do in most situations was keep his thoughts entirely to himself. He was 22 years old when he performed his first official execution. The morning of it felt, in some ways, like any other working morning. The sentence had already been decided long before Charles-Henri arrived. The paperwork was signed and stamped. The court had spoken. His role was simply to be the moment where the speaking ended and the reality began. The crowd arrived early. That was the first thing that struck him. They had come early, and they had come in numbers, filling the square and spilling into the surrounding streets, finding positions with the focused determination of people who did not want to miss anything. He had known, intellectually, that public executions drew crowds. He had not quite internalized, until that morning, what those crowds felt like from the scaffold. All those faces turned in one direction, all that collective attention pressing forward, the noise of it, the weight of it, the strange electricity of thousands of people gathered together around a single irreversible moment. He did the job correctly, clean, efficient, no hesitation and no theatre. Everything his father had taught him applied exactly as it had been taught. The crowd reacted anyway, because crowds always react, regardless of what actually happens in front of them. Some cheered, some complained it had been too fast. Someone near the back shouted something he could not make out. A woman wept loudly enough for half the square to hear. Within minutes of it being over, people were already discussing it, comparing it, assessing it, as if they were critics leaving a performance rather than citizens watching the law complete its work. He cleaned his equipment afterward and said nothing. What genuinely surprised him in the days that followed was the discovery that people wanted to compare his work to that of another young executioner operating in a neighboring district, whose blade had been cleaner, whose condemned had been calmer, whose crowd had responded better. He had not realized this was a competitive profession. He filed the observation somewhere quiet and went back to work. The France that Charles-Henri moved through in the 1770s and early 1780s was a country that looked, on its surface, exactly like what it had always been. The king sat on his throne at Versailles. The nobility attended their parties. The church rang its bells. The markets opened every morning, and the bread was bought, and the wine was drunk, and life proceeded in its familiar patterns. But underneath all of that, something was pulling apart. The gap between the people who had everything and the people who had nothing had been widening for so long that most people had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a crack in a wall you walk past every day. It was simply there, until the day the wall came down. Charles-Henri was not a political man. He had learned early that strong opinions were a luxury his position could not afford. But he watched. He always watched. He was a man whose entire profession required him to read a room, to understand the emotional temperature of a crowd, to know when something was about to shift. And in the streets of Paris, in those years before the Revolution, something was very clearly about to shift. He prepared himself in the quiet way he prepared himself for everything, by simply continuing to do his job and waiting to see what the world would ask of him next. The revolution arrived in 1789 with the absolute certainty that everything that had come before it had been wrong, which is how revolutions always arrive. The king's authority collapsed, the old courts were swept away and replaced by committees with longer names and considerably shorter patience. Titles were abolished, streets were renamed, statues were pulled down. France was reinventing itself from the foundations upward, loudly and urgently, and with the specific kind of confidence that comes from people who have been furious for a very long time and have finally decided to do something about it. Charles-Henri remained employed. This was not a surprise to him. Revolutions, as he understood, are very generous with sentences. The new republic spoke constantly about liberty and equality and the rights of the people. What it spoke about less frequently was who would be responsible for carrying out the verdicts when the tribunal finished for the day. That particular detail had a way of resolving itself quietly, without speeches or ceremonies, in his direction. The crowds were different now, though. He noticed it immediately. Before the revolution, crowds at executions had come with a complex mixture of emotions: curiosity, moral satisfaction, and a kind of grim entertainment that nobody quite admitted to. The revolutionary crowds came with something simpler and more frightening. They came with certainty. They came knowing they were right, and they wanted the work done fast, because efficiency felt like progress, and progress was what the revolution was supposed to be about. Charles-Henri adapted, as he always adapted. He kept his face neutral. He did his job. He went home. Then the guillotine arrived. It came in 1792, announced as one of the great humanitarian achievements of the modern age. And in certain ways, the people saying that were not entirely wrong. The old methods of execution had been brutal and inconsistent, dependent on the skill and the mood of the man performing them, in ways that made the same sentence feel completely different depending on where and when it was carried out. The guillotine removed that inconsistency. One mechanism, one motion, the same outcome every single time, regardless of the condemned person's name or background or the executioner's state of mind that morning. Equality, they called it. Progress. Charles-Henri stood beside the device on the day it was first assembled in the square and studied it the way he studied every tool he was expected to work with. The blade had to align precisely every time. The mechanism had to reset quickly because the tribunal was already making clear that it did not intend to produce names slowly. The crowd standing around the newly assembled machine was excited in a way that Charles-Henri found quietly instructive. They were excited about the efficiency, about the speed, about the idea that justice could now be delivered at scale. He understood in that moment what the guillotine actually was. It was not just a more humane method of execution, it was a machine designed to process a very large number of sentences in a very short period of time. And he was the man who was going to be operating it. The Reign of Terror began in 1793, and what it asked of Charles-Henri Sanson was something that had no precedent in his family's long history of service to the French legal system. The lists started arriving. Not one name at a time, the way sentences had always come before. Lists, pages of them. Nobles, priests, merchants, politicians, soldiers, servants, ordinary men and women whose connection to counter-revolution was sometimes clear and documented, and sometimes nothing more than the accusation of a neighbor with a grudge. The Revolutionary Tribunal worked with extraordinary speed. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety had decided that the Republic was under threat from within, that enemies were everywhere, and that the only way to secure the revolution was to remove those enemies faster than they could organize against it. Charles-Henri received the lists, and he worked. On some days during the peak of the terror, he carried out more than 30 executions in a single afternoon. 30. The mechanism reset between each one. The blade was checked. The procedure was followed exactly as it had always been followed, because this was the one thing he could control in a period when everything else had lost its shape. The crowd that filled the square during those months had stopped reacting to individual executions the way they once had. There were simply too many to react to individually. They watched the way people watch traffic, with a general attention that registered movement without stopping to consider each specific thing moving through it. He did not break. That bears saying clearly, because it is the thing about Charles-Henri Sanson that is most difficult to understand from where we stand today. He did not break. He did not flee. He did not refuse. He showed up every day to a job that had become something so far beyond what any human being should reasonably be asked to carry that the mind struggles to hold it, and he performed it with the same quiet professionalism he had brought to his first execution more than 30 years earlier. Whether that was strength or numbness, or simply the result of a lifetime of being prepared for exactly this, even if nobody had known it would ever reach this scale, is a question that has no clean answer. On the 21st of January 1793, a name appeared on the list that made even the most hardened members of the tribunal pause before confirming it in writing. Louis XVI, King of France. The morning of his execution was unlike anything Paris had ever produced. The crowds began gathering before dawn, filling the Place de la Révolution and every street leading into it, until the city felt like it was holding its breath. Soldiers in bright blue revolutionary uniforms lined every approach to the scaffold. The cold winter air was sharp and clear, the sky pale gold above the rooftops, the kind of morning that makes everything look more significant than it might otherwise. The king arrived in a carriage. He was 51 years old, and he looked it. A heavy man in plain white clothing, his manner quiet and composed in a way that surprised the crowd, who had perhaps expected something more dramatic. He had prepared himself. He had spoken with a priest. He had written letters to his family. He climbed the scaffold steps without assistance. Charles-Henri was already there. The two men had never met before that morning. One had spent his entire life at the very top of the structure that organized French society. The other had spent his entire life at the very bottom of it, acknowledged as necessary and kept at a careful distance by everyone in between. On that cold January morning, for just a few minutes, they occupied exactly the same piece of ground. The execution was carried out correctly. The blade fell. The crowd's reaction was not the roar that had greeted so many of the terror's executions. It was something stranger, a kind of stunned collective sound, as if the city had just done something it had been building toward for years, and now, in the moment of having done it, was not entirely sure what came next. Charles-Henri cleaned the mechanism. He reset the blade. The list continued. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette followed her husband to the same scaffold. If the king's execution had felt like the revolution making a statement, the queen's felt like something more personal and more cruel. She had been held in prison for months by that point, her hair cut short, her clothing plain. Everything that had once made her the most recognizable woman in Europe systematically stripped away. She was 37 years old, and she looked older. The crowd that gathered for her execution was louder and angrier than the one that had come for her husband. with a particular hostility that she faced with the same quiet composure she had somehow maintained through everything that had been done to her. She stumbled slightly on the scaffold steps. She turned to Charles-Henri and said, quietly, "I beg your pardon, I did not do it on purpose." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He did his job. She died the way the guillotine ensured everyone died, quickly and without theatre. The crowd cheered. The list continued. Those 7 words she spoke to him are the only recorded conversation between Charles-Henri Sanson and any of the people he executed across his entire career. He never spoke about it publicly. He never wrote about it. Whatever those words did to him, whatever quiet corner of himself he filed them in, he kept that entirely to himself, the way he kept everything entirely to himself, the way his father had taught him to do when he was a boy too young to fully understand why. Robespierre fell in July of 1794, brought down by the very mechanism of suspicion and denunciation he had helped to build, arrested by men who had themselves been signing death warrants for the past year and had begun to worry that their own names might appear on the next list. He arrived at the Place de la Révolution on the 28th of July with a bandaged jaw, the result of a wound sustained during his arrest, his face pale and his manner stripped of the absolute certainty that had defined his public presence throughout the terror. The crowd that had cheered so many of his enemies to the scaffold now turned the same energy toward him, with the particular enthusiasm of people who had been afraid of someone for a long time and were relieved to no longer have to pretend otherwise. Charles-Henri was there. He had been there for the king. He had been there for the queen. He had been there for the noblemen and the merchants and the priests and the ordinary citizens and the politicians and the soldiers. He was there for the man who had, more than almost anyone else, been responsible for turning the list into a daily reality of industrial scale. He carried out the execution, cleanly, correctly, the way he had carried out every execution before it. The terror was over. The lists slowed. Paris began the long, complicated process of deciding how to feel about what it had just lived through, the way cities always do after they have done something they cannot entirely explain. Charles-Henri Sanson retired in 1795. He passed the position to his son Gabriel, continuing the family tradition that had governed the Sansons for 6 generations, and stepped back from the work that had defined every day of his adult life. He was 56 years old. He had served as the official executioner of Paris for over 4 decades. He had worked under a king, through a revolution, across the full span of the most violent political period in French history, and into the quieter years that followed. The total number of executions he personally performed across his career was somewhere above 2,700, a number so large it barely feels real, until you sit with it for a moment and let it become what it actually is. 2,700 individual human lives, each one ending at the same point, in the same square, with the same man standing beside the same mechanism. He died in 1806. He was 67 years old. He did not leave behind dramatic final statements or philosophical reflections on the 40 years he had spent in service to French justice. He left behind a name on a grave in the cemetery of Montmartre, simple and unadorned, no different from thousands of other names carved into thousands of other stones across the city. Paris did not pause to mark his passing. The city moved on, the way cities always move on, forward and without much looking back. But here is the thing about Charles-Henri Sanson that stays with you long after the dates and the numbers have faded. He never chose this. Not the profession, not the timing, not the revolution, not the terror, not the lists that arrived each morning with dozens of names written on them in neat official handwriting. None of it was his decision. He was handed a life the way you are handed a coat and told to put it on, and he wore it every day for 67 years without ever once, as far as anyone can tell, putting it down and walking away. There is a question buried inside his story that does not have a comfortable answer. What does it do to a person to spend their entire life being the last step in a process that everyone agrees is necessary, but nobody wants to look at directly? To be the man that the law needs, but the city prefers not to think about. To go home every evening to your family and eat your dinner and sleep in your bed, and wake up the next morning and do it again. Charles-Henri Sanson never answered that question. Not publicly. Not in any document that survived. He kept the inside of his life as carefully private as he kept his expression during his working hours, which is to say completely. What he left behind was the record. 2,700 executions, 40 years of service, a family name that 6 generations carried through the streets of a city that crossed the road when they saw it coming, and one sentence spoken to him by a queen on a cold October morning, 7 words offered in the split second between a stumble and a steadying. "I beg your pardon, I did not do it on purpose." He never told anyone what he thought about those words. Maybe that is answer enough. And that is the story of Charles-Henri Sanson, a man who never chose the life he lived, never complained about the weight he carried, and never once walked away from it. He simply showed up, did what was asked of him, and went home, every single day, for 40 years. History remembers the kings and the revolutions, but it forgot to ask about the man who was always standing at the end of it all. Now you know his name. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and drop a comment below. Tell me which part of his story hit you the hardest. I read every single one. Subscribe to Legends Untold and ring the notification bell so you never miss a legend. New stories drop on this channel every month. Also share this with someone who loves a good story. This has been Legends Untold, and the next legend is already on its way.